It was an ordinary morning when she walked into the bank. The sun was shining brightly outside, and the streets were buzzing with the usual rush of people. The woman, a confident and well-dressed black woman, had just finished her meetings for the day and had come to the bank to take care of some financial matters. She stood in line, checking her phone for messages while waiting her turn. Everything felt normal, just like any other errand she had done countless times before. She had always been a calm and organized person, someone who never let anything throw her off course. Today, she wore a smart blue dress, her hair neatly tied back, and her posture showed confidence. She didn't expect anything unusual to happen. Little did she know, the day would soon take a strange turn. As she waited patiently, the bank was busy with other customers, all handling their own business. The air was filled with the low hum of conversation, the sound of paper shuffling, and the tapping of keyboards. It was a typical morning at the bank. Across the room, an officer sat near the entrance. He was a middle-aged man in a police uniform, and at first he seemed to be going about his work. He was quietly observing the crowd, his eyes scanning the room. He glanced at the woman once, and then again. There was something about the way she was standing, the way she was carrying herself that seemed to catch his attention. He watched her for a few moments more as she waited for the line to move. He felt a strange unease in his stomach, something he couldn't quite explain. She seemed calm, confident, and perhaps a little too collected for someone like her in a place like this. He had a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just her presence, it was her appearance. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it made him suspicious. His eyes narrowed as he continued to watch her, his suspicion growing stronger. The woman, completely unaware of the officer's gaze, simply checked her phone and waited. She didn't look at anyone around her. She was used to people's stares, but she didn't let it affect her. She was used to going about her business without drawing attention. But the officer's eyes followed her every move, his judgment clouding his thoughts. She was just another person in line, but to him, something felt off. He told himself that it was his job to be cautious, that he had to make sure everything was in order. But deep down, he was already making assumptions based on something as simple as the color of her skin. Soon, her turn came, and she walked up to the counter to speak with a bank representative. She smiled politely at the teller and started explaining her needs. All the while, the officer remained where he was, watching. His suspicion hadn't gone away, and it would soon push him to make a decision that would change everything. As the woman stood at the counter, her transaction was moving smoothly. She handed over the required documents to the teller, explaining what she needed with a clear, calm voice. She had been in banks like this many times before. There was nothing unusual about today, nothing that should have raised any concerns. She was simply going about her day, just as anyone else would. But to the officer watching from across the room, everything seemed wrong. He had been staring at her for a while now, and the more he watched, the more uneasy he felt. His suspicion continued to grow, twisting in his mind. He tried to focus on the other customers, but his eyes always seemed to drift back to her. It was as though something about her didn't sit right. She wasn't acting out of the ordinary, yet he felt an odd sense of discomfort every time he glanced her way. He wasn't sure what bothered him exactly, but his thoughts were clouded with doubt. Maybe it was the way she moved so confidently, like she belonged there. Maybe it was her calm expression, the way she handled everything so effortlessly. To him, it felt like she was too confident for someone like her, and that thought made his suspicion grow even stronger. But he couldn't put his finger on it. All he knew was that his job was to be vigilant, and right now, something felt off. He kept his distance, watching her every move. There were plenty of other people in the bank, but it was her he was focused on. He didn't trust how she held herself, and the longer he watched, the more convinced he became that something wasn't right. He told himself it was just his training kicking in. After all, police officers had to be alert to anything out of the ordinary. But deep down, The officer knew that his gut was telling him more than just to be cautious. His judgment was clouded by his own assumptions. As the woman finished her conversation with the teller, the officer stood up, his gaze never leaving her. She seemed so composed, so relaxed. He could see that she was done with her transaction, and now she was heading toward the exit. But before she could reach the door, he stepped forward, intercepting her path. He felt a sense of authority rush through him as he blocked her way. "Excuse me, Mom," he said, his voice firm and direct. "Can I ask what you're doing here today?" The woman looked up at him, surprised by the sudden interruption. She was just minding her own business, but she didn't let her confusion show. She remained calm, answering him politely. "I'm just handling some personal bank matters. Is everything okay?" But the officer wasn't convinced. He felt like there was something more to it, something he couldn't explain. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer, but he knew one thing. He needed to act on his instincts. He asked her for her identification, his voice now edged with more authority. The woman raised an eyebrow, still calm, but starting to feel uneasy. "Why are you questioning me?" she asked, her voice steady but a little firmer now. "I'm just doing my business here, like everyone else." But the officer wasn't listening. He had made up his mind. As far as he was concerned, she was acting suspicious, and he wasn't going to let her get away without an explanation. And just like that, the tension in the bank thickened. What had started as a normal visit to the bank was turning into something much more serious. The woman's heart began to race. She had no idea why she was being singled out, but she wasn't about to let this situation escalate without a fight. Little did she know, things were about to get far worse. The woman's heart began to race as the officer's demand for identification sank in. She had been calm, expecting nothing more than a simple bank visit, but now her stomach churned. She tried to remain composed, but something about the way the officer spoke, so certain, so accusatory, made her feel uneasy. She didn't know why she was being treated this way, but she had always been good at keeping her emotions in check. She stood up straight, holding her ground. "Why do you need to see my ID?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with confusion. The officer didn't answer her right away. His eyes narrowed as he stared at her, as though searching for something, anything, that would justify his actions. He wasn't listening to her calm responses. In his mind, he had already made up his mind about her. The way she stood there, the way she spoke, it didn't seem right to him. He hadn't expected this calm, composed woman to challenge him. His suspicion had turned into a need for control, and now he was determined to make her explain herself. "I need to verify who you are," he said flatly, his tone colder than before. "I think you're acting suspicious, and I have to take you in for questioning." The woman was stunned. "Questioning? For what?" "I haven't done anything wrong," she replied, her calm beginning to crack just a little. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. All she wanted was to complete her business and go home. But the officer wasn't listening. He wasn't interested in hearing her explanations or seeing her point of view. He had already decided that she was guilty of something, though he couldn't say exactly what. He reached for his handcuffs and moved closer to her. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice shaking now. "Are you really going to arrest me for no reason?" Without answering, the officer grabbed her arm firmly. The sudden contact took her by surprise, and she instinctively pulled back, feeling her heart race. The situation was spiraling out of control. The other customers in the bank had stopped what they were doing and were now watching the scene unfold. Some of them whispered among themselves, clearly uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up. It felt like everyone was holding their breath, unsure of what to do next. The woman's mind raced, trying to make sense of the officer's actions. She had done nothing wrong. All she had done was visit the bank for a simple transaction, but now she was being treated like a criminal. She tried to stay calm, tried to reason with the officer again, but her voice was starting to falter as she realized he wasn't interested in her explanation. The officer didn't care about her words. With a firm grip on her arm, he led her out of the bank. She didn't want to resist. She didn't want to make the situation worse. But the humiliation she felt was overwhelming. Her heart pounded in her chest as she walked, surrounded by the eyes of everyone in the bank, all of them silently watching. Some of the whispers grew louder, but no one said anything to stop the officer. As they stepped outside into the bright sunlight, the officer guided her toward the police car, and that's when it hit her. This was real. She was really being arrested, and for no reason at all. The disbelief settled in her chest as she realized that this was not just about a simple mistake. It was about something deeper, something that went far beyond the bank. But as she was about to get into the car, she saw a familiar face approaching from across the street. The powerful figure she had been meeting at the bank was walking quickly toward her. The person she had come to meet, someone important, had arrived just in time. The officer, still holding her arm tightly, didn't see what was coming next, but everything was about to change. As the officer led the woman out of the bank, the scene grew more intense. People were staring, some in shock, others whispering among themselves. The woman's heart was pounding in her chest as she walked toward the police car, her eyes darting from one face to another. She could feel the weight of the stares, but she refused to let the embarrassment show. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. She had only come to the bank to take care of a small task, but now everything had spiraled out of control. Some of the people in the bank were clearly uncomfortable with what they were seeing. They had watched as the officer questioned her, and now they were witnessing her being escorted out of the building in handcuffs. It was hard to ignore the growing tension in the air. The officer's grip on her arm was tight, almost like he was trying to make a point, but the woman kept her head held high. From where she stood, she could see a few people reaching for their phones, snapping pictures of the scene. The woman didn't want to be the subject of anyone's camera, but she knew there was nothing she could do to stop it now. She focused on taking slow, steady breaths, trying to block out the chaos around her. As they walked through the doors, someone in the crowd finally spoke up. A man, probably in his early 30s, called out from behind them. "What are you arresting her for? What's going on here?" His voice was firm, and it cut through the quiet tension like a sharp knife. The officer didn't respond at first. His face was unreadable, but the woman could see a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He was used to being in control, but now, with people questioning his actions, he seemed unsure of how to answer. The woman's eyes locked with the man's for a brief moment. She wanted to shout out the truth, to explain that this was all a mistake, but she knew it wouldn't change anything right now. Instead, she gave him a small, silent nod, thankful for the support. Another woman, standing near the doors, spoke up next. "She's done nothing wrong. I saw everything. Why are you arresting her?" Her voice was quieter, but just as filled with disbelief. The officer shifted his weight, avoiding eye contact with the crowd. He wasn't prepared for the attention, and it was clear that his actions were starting to backfire. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. "This is ridiculous," someone said. "We need to know why she's being treated like this." A few people started to move closer, gathering around the officer and the woman. The crowd wasn't hostile, but their curiosity and growing concern were impossible to ignore. The officer had now become the center of attention, and it was clear that he didn't like it. His hands tightened on the woman's arm, but she wasn't going to let the situation break her. Through the noise, the woman could hear a few more people speaking out, showing their disapproval of the officer's actions. She felt a small sense of relief. It was comforting to know that others were seeing what she was seeing, that this wasn't just a misunderstanding, but a case of someone being unfairly treated because of assumptions that had no basis in reality. The officer, realizing the crowd was growing in size and tension, seemed to hesitate for the first time. He had been so focused on controlling the situation that he hadn't noticed the attention it was drawing. His grip on the woman's arm softened just slightly, but it was too late to undo the damage he had caused. The woman's gaze moved past the officer to the growing crowd. It was as if they had become witnesses to her story, and in some strange way, that made her feel a little less alone. But before the situation could escalate any further, a new voice cut through the air, a voice she recognized, someone she had been waiting for. Just as the tension between the officer and the crowd reached its peak, the woman saw a familiar face pushing through the gathering people. Her heart skipped a beat when she recognized who it was. The person she had come to meet at the bank, someone important, was rushing toward her, walking briskly with a serious expression. She had been waiting for this moment, but she hadn't expected it to happen under these circumstances. The crowd seemed to part as the powerful figure reached the officer and the woman. It was a person with significant influence, someone well known in the city, and someone who could make waves with just a few words. The officer, still holding the woman by the arm, looked up in surprise as the person approached. The powerful figure wasted no time. They looked at the officer with a mix of confusion and disbelief, clearly not understanding what was happening. "What's going on here? Why is she being arrested?" the figure asked, their voice firm but calm. They were not raised to back down, especially when injustice was at play. The officer's face went pale as he realized who was standing before him. He had never expected this. His mind raced as the gravity of the situation set in. He hadn't expected the woman to be meeting someone of this stature, let alone someone who could cause real trouble for him. The officer cleared his throat and tried to regain his composure. "She was acting suspicious, so I needed to question her," he stammered, but his words sounded weak, even to his own ears. The powerful figure did not let him get away with such an explanation. "Suspicious," they repeated, their tone growing colder. "Do you have any real evidence that she's done anything wrong? Because from where I'm standing, you're just making assumptions about her based on nothing." The crowd, which had been murmuring and whispering up until that point, fell completely silent. It was clear that the officer was losing control of the situation. The powerful figure stood tall, unwavering. They turned their attention to the woman and said gently, "Are you all right?" The woman, who had been quietly enduring the officer's unjust treatment, nodded. She still couldn't believe what was happening, but she found a sense of comfort in knowing someone had arrived who could challenge the officer's actions. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice still carried the strain of the ordeal. The officer, now visibly uncomfortable, looked down, avoiding eye contact. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by the heavy weight of his mistake. He tried to explain himself again, but his voice was no longer as commanding as it had been before. I was just doing my job," he muttered, his words faltering. The powerful figure took a step closer to the officer, their presence undeniable. "You made a serious mistake," they said, their voice low but clear enough for everyone around to hear. "And now you need to correct it." There was no room for argument in their words. They were a person used to making things happen, and they expected the officer to listen. The officer, his face flushed with embarrassment, took a step back. He had no choice but to release the woman from his grip, and he quickly did so, his movements stiff and reluctant. The woman, though shaken, stepped away from him and turned toward the powerful figure. The tension in the air slowly began to lift, and the crowd began to murmur in approval, sensing that justice was finally being done. For the woman, this moment was bittersweet. She had been humiliated, wrongfully arrested, and made to feel like a criminal, but she wasn't defeated. Now, with this powerful ally at her side, she felt a renewed sense of hope. The officer, though he had been forced to release her, would likely face consequences for his actions, and she was determined to make sure that what happened to her would not be forgotten. The officer's face turned pale as he stood there, stunned by the powerful figure standing before him. He hadn't expected this at all. His mind raced, trying to figure out how to get out of the situation he had created. For a moment, he stood frozen, staring at the figure. His thoughts were a jumble of confusion and panic. He had never imagined that this woman he had treated so unfairly was connected to someone so influential. The powerful figure didn't waste time. With a calm, steady voice, they addressed the officer again. "You've made a big mistake. You didn't even take a moment to think before making your assumptions. That's not how this works." Their tone was firm, but there was no shouting or anger, just a clear demand for accountability. The officer shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. He had made a rash decision based on his own judgments, and now it was clear he was facing the consequences. His previous confidence, the sense of authority he had carried with him just moments ago, was completely gone. He was no longer the one in control. I didn't mean any harm," the officer stammered, trying to explain himself, but his words felt weak, almost powerless. "I was just doing my job." She seemed out of place, and I thought. "You thought wrong," the powerful figure interrupted. Their words cut through his explanation like a sharp blade. "You didn't think at all. You just assumed something about her. And now you're paying the price." The officer shifted nervously on his feet. He had no excuse. The powerful figure's eyes never left him, and the crowd that had gathered around them was silent, watching the scene unfold. It was clear that they had all witnessed something wrong. The officer's mistake was too obvious to ignore. The woman, though still shaken, stood beside the powerful figure. She hadn't said anything yet, but she didn't need to. The look in her eyes, filled with both hurt and determination, said everything. The officer had no choice but to face the reality of what he had done. The powerful figure turned their attention back to the officer. "You're going to make this right," they said firmly, their voice calm but filled with authority. "You're going to apologize to her, and you're going to explain yourself to the people who were watching. You don't get to treat someone this way without facing the consequences." The officer swallowed hard. He had hoped this would just be a simple interaction, that he could take her in and deal with it later, but now everything had changed. His career, his reputation, it all depended on what happened next. The powerful figure wasn't going to let him off easy. They were demanding accountability, and everyone around them was watching, waiting to see what he would do. He took a deep breath, his face flushed with embarrassment. He finally turned to the woman, looking her in the eye. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I shouldn't have treated you like that." The woman looked at him, her expression unreadable. She had every right to be angry, to lash out at him for what he had done. But instead, she stayed silent. Her silence spoke volumes. The officer's apology didn't erase what had happened, but it was a start. She didn't need to forgive him in that moment, but at least he was acknowledging his mistake. As the officer stepped back, the powerful figure turned to the crowd, their voice carrying across the bank. "This is what happens when people act based on assumptions and prejudices," they said. "We need to do better. We need to treat everyone with respect, no matter who they are." The crowd murmured in agreement, and for the first time, the tension in the air seemed to lift. The officer had apologized, and the powerful figure's words had struck a chord with everyone who had witnessed the scene. The woman, though still shaken, felt a small sense of justice. She had stood up for herself, and now she wasn't alone. The moment the officer apologized, the air in the bank shifted. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted, but the feeling wasn't entirely one of relief. Instead, it was the uncomfortable realization that what had just happened couldn't be undone. The powerful figure's presence had calmed the situation for now, but the damage was done, and the onlookers knew it. The crowd, which had been watching in tense silence, began to stir. Some people murmured quietly to each other. Others were still taking pictures, recording the events as they unfolded. There was a buzz of conversation, but no one was speaking directly to the officer. No one was giving him the chance to explain further. His apology had been weak, and it had done little to quiet the growing sense of outrage among the crowd. The woman, though still processing everything that had just happened, found herself standing taller. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her now, not in judgment, but in support. They had seen the officer's unfair treatment, and they were now witnessing the consequences of his actions. The powerful figure standing beside her wasn't just an ally. They were a symbol of justice in that moment. A man who had been near the door earlier, the one who had first questioned the officer, stepped forward again. He raised his voice, making sure the officer could hear him clearly. This shouldn't be happening. She shouldn't have been treated like that in the first place. The way she was arrested, no questions asked. That's not how we treat people. The officer flinched at the man's words, his gaze dropping to the floor. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him now, the sense of scrutiny heavy on his shoulders. The words he had spoken earlier, accusing the woman of being suspicious, seemed foolish in the face of the growing backlash. The powerful figure nodded in agreement, turning to face the crowd. "You're absolutely right," they said, their voice loud and clear. "This is a reminder of how harmful assumptions and prejudices can be. It's important that we stand up when we see something wrong, and it's equally important that we hold people accountable when they misuse their power." As the powerful figure spoke, more voices joined in. "We shouldn't let things like this slide," a woman called from the back of the crowd. "It's happening too often, and it needs to stop." Her words were echoed by others, each person adding their voice to the chorus. The officer stood still, his face flushed with embarrassment, as the voices of those around him grew stronger. The woman who had been wrongfully arrested didn't speak. She simply watched as the situation played out, grateful for the support, but still feeling the sting of the injustice. This wasn't the kind of attention she had wanted, but in a strange way, it made her feel less alone. The people who had watched everything unfold now had a chance to be part of something bigger, a chance to be part of a movement that demanded fairness and respect for all. As the murmurs of the crowd continued, the officer took a step back. He seemed to shrink under the weight of his actions. The powerful figure turned to the woman and gave her a small, reassuring nod. She had stood her ground, and now it was clear that the officer would face the consequences of his unjust actions. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. The crowd had spoken, and they had made it clear that they would not stand for such behavior. The officer's apology had been a small step in the right direction, but it was the public backlash, the voices of the people, that would have the lasting impact. The woman knew this wasn't the end, but she also knew that today, change had begun. The officer stood there, surrounded by a growing crowd of people who were all watching him, their gazes filled with disbelief and disappointment. His heart raced, and his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He had been too quick to judge, and now, in front of so many witnesses, it was clear he had made a huge mistake. He was used to being in control, to making decisions with authority. But today, he had been caught in a situation that he couldn't escape. The weight of it was suffocating. The powerful figure beside the woman remained calm, their presence undeniable. They had taken charge of the situation, and now the officer was facing the consequences of his actions. The powerful figure turned to the crowd, who had been growing louder with every moment. "This is what happens when we let assumptions guide our actions," they said, their voice steady but filled with authority. "It's time for accountability, and we can't let this kind of behavior go unnoticed." The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective voice growing louder. They weren't just witnesses anymore. They were participants in a call for justice. The officer could feel the pressure building. The people around him were holding him accountable for his actions, and there was no way for him to escape the truth of what he had done. The powerful figure turned back to the officer. "You've made a serious mistake today," they said firmly, "and you're going to have to face the consequences. Your actions were unjust, and now you need to explain yourself, not just to her, but to everyone who saw what happened." The officer's face turned red with embarrassment, but he knew there was no way out. He nodded slowly, his mouth dry. "I understand," he muttered. The powerful figure turned to the woman, offering a comforting smile. She had stood silently through all of this, but now she could feel a small sense of justice returning. Her ordeal wasn't over, but today something had changed. The officer finally stepped forward, his voice shaky but apologetic. "I'm sorry," he said to the woman. His words were hesitant, but at least he had acknowledged the mistake he had made. The woman looked at him for a moment, and then, without saying a word, she nodded. It wasn't forgiveness that she was offering him, but the simple acknowledgement that the apology was a start. The powerful figure turned to the people around them, making sure everyone could hear. "This is just the beginning," they said. "What happened today is not just about one officer and one woman. It's about all of us. It's about standing up when we see injustice and making sure that those in power are held responsible for their actions. We cannot let this go. We will continue to fight for fairness." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in support of what had just taken place. The officer, who had once felt so sure of his authority, was now a symbol of the consequences of unchecked prejudice. His actions had made him the target of the very people he had tried to control. The woman, though still processing everything, felt a sense of calm wash over her. This moment was not just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for everyone who had ever faced prejudice. She had stood up, and now she knew that the message was clear. Change was coming, and it was because people had refused to let injustice go unchallenged. As the crowd began to disperse, the powerful figure placed a hand on the woman's shoulder. "You did well today," they said softly. "Your strength will make a difference." The woman smiled, a sense of pride filling her. She had faced something difficult, but in the end, she had made a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who would follow in her footsteps. As the crowd began to thin, the officer was left standing alone, his head hung low. The powerful figure, who had helped turn the situation around, stayed with the woman for a few moments. The tension from earlier had finally started to fade, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. The woman felt exhausted, but also stronger than she had felt in a long time. She had never imagined that a routine visit to the bank would turn into something so life-changing. But now, standing in the midst of the fading crowd, she realized that this moment had the power to bring about real change. The officer, still standing by the door, was no longer surrounded by people. He had been forced to face the truth, and the looks of disapproval from those around him made it clear that his actions would not be forgotten. His career, his reputation, everything was now in jeopardy. The powerful figure had made sure that he understood the seriousness of what he had done, and they had promised that the matter would not end there. The woman, though still processing everything, turned to the powerful figure who had come to her aid. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." The powerful figure smiled warmly at her. "It's the least I could do," they said. "No one should ever be treated like that. You didn't deserve any of it, but you handled yourself with incredible strength." The woman nodded, feeling a sense of peace settling over her. Though the experience had been painful, she knew that something important had happened today. The officer had been forced to confront his own mistakes, and the crowd had spoken up, demanding justice. For the first time, she felt like the injustice she had faced had not only been noticed, it had been addressed. As she walked out of the bank, she felt the weight of the stairs lifting. People were no longer looking at her with judgment. Instead, there was a sense of respect. She had stood up for herself, and the support of the crowd and the powerful figure had made all the difference. The officer had apologized, but that wasn't enough. The community had seen what had happened, and they had made it clear that this kind of treatment wouldn't be tolerated. Later, the woman's story began to spread. News outlets picked up the story, and soon it was being talked about everywhere. People who had seen the event unfold began to share their own experiences. Others spoke out about similar incidents, and the conversation about prejudice and injustice grew louder. It wasn't just about one officer's actions anymore. It was about a larger problem that needed to be addressed. The powerful figure, too, became more involved in the conversation, speaking at events and calling for changes in how people in positions of power were held accountable for their actions. They used their platform to encourage others to stand up, to speak out, and to hold those in authority responsible when they made mistakes. For the woman, the journey wasn't over. But today, she had made an impact. She had shown everyone, including herself, that standing up in the face of injustice was not only possible, but it was powerful. Her strength had started a conversation, and that conversation was the first step toward real change. As she walked away from the bank, she felt a sense of pride that she had made a difference. She knew this was just the beginning, but she was ready for whatever came next. Change was coming, and she was going to be part of it.